Little Hemsby, on that particular autumn morning, had the kind of crisp air that bit at your cheeks and put a spring in your step, the kind of morning where the village looked like a postcard no one sent. The cobbled lanes gleamed with last night's rain, and the chimneys coughed out thin plumes of smoke that curled into a sky just waking from grey to blue. Mothers called after wool-headed children, a dog barked at nothing, and old Mr. Prentice at the corner shop wiped down his windows like the whole village was under inspection. But little Hemsby wasn't under inspection. Not officially. Not yet. Down at the tea shop the brass bell over the door clanged as Mrs. Hartwell bustled in, cheeks pink from the chill and lips pursed tight enough to snap a thread. She leaned across the counter, the smell of lavender and boiled cabbage trailing after her. "Terrible business," she whispered, though the room was empty but for Miss Jenkins, who, at 72, had ears sharper than a fox and eyes that had missed nothing in 5 decades. "Lady Eleanor, found dead in her own sitting-room, police swarming about like hornets." "Dead?" Miss Jenkins gasped, nearly dropping her spoon into her teacup. "What from?" Mrs. Hartwell glanced around for effect, though there wasn't a soul to overhear, then leaned in closer. "Murder, they say." That word, murder, cracked through little Hemsby like a dropped plate. By noon it was on every tongue, slipping through hedges and over fences. The postman paused his route to speculate, the blacksman down tools to mutter darkly about money and morals. And at the heart of it all stood Hensley Manor, Lady Eleanor's sprawling estate, a stone colossus at the edge of town, its ivy-clad walls glaring down like an old governess disapproving of the world. It was there, just inside the grand entrance, that the details grew darker. A porcelain teacup lay shattered on the oriental rug, the spilled tea dark as blood against the intricate patterns. The fire had gone out in the hearth, leaving the room cold, despite the velvet curtains that hung heavy and suffocating. On the side table, a letter, half open, its edges stained with something darker than ink, and on the floor a single lock of chestnut hair gleamed in the slanting light. The police poked and prodded, but the villagers, they had their own theories. "It's that Sir Reginald, I'd wager," someone whispered outside the bakery. "Always hanging about Lady Eleanor, wasn't he?" "Too friendly, if you ask me," another voice chimed in. "There's talk, you know, about the two of them." Talk. Little Hemsby thrived on it. Down by the village green, Sir Reginald himself stood under the skeletal branches of a beech tree, collar turned up against the cold. His face, lined but still handsome in a faded sort of way, was drawn tight with something between grief and anger. Across from him, Dr. Whittaker, friend, confidant, and occasional partner in gin-soaked chess matches, watched him with careful eyes. "You need to keep your head," Whittaker said quietly. "I didn't kill her," Reginald snapped, then sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair. "God help me, Whit. I didn't. I believe you." "Doesn't mean they will." Reginald's gaze drifted toward the manor, a shadow passing through his expression. "She was complicated. You know how people talk. We were close, yes, but this—" He shook his head. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Whittaker glanced at the gathering crowd, voices buzzing like wasps. "Truth is, Reg, doesn't matter what's supposed to happen, only what people believe did, and right now, they believe you." Across the street, Miss Marple watched from the window of the tea shop, a quiet observer sipping a cup of weak Earl Grey. Her face, lined with the years but sharp with curiosity, betrayed nothing. Observing people was like knitting, she always said. Take enough stitches, pay close enough attention, and a pattern emerged. And this morning, she thought, stirring her tea, the pattern looked rather twisted indeed. The sun dipped lower as the village clung to its routines. Children herded home for supper. The baker's boy pulled down the shop shutters. But the air stayed thick with something unsaid. Somewhere in the folds of gossip and grief, truth waited. Hidden. Quiet. Watching. And Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and steady hands, was already threading the first stitch. Little Hemsby on that particular autumn morning had the kind of crisp air that bit at your cheeks and put a spring in your step, the kind of morning where the village looked like a postcard no one sent. The cobbled lanes gleamed with last night's rain, and the chimneys coughed out thin plumes of smoke that curled into a sky just waking from grey to blue. Mothers called after wool-hatted children, a dog barked at nothing, and old Mr. Prentice at the corner shop wiped down his windows like the whole village was under inspection. But little Hemsby wasn't under inspection, not officially, not yet. Down at the tea-shop, the brass bell over the door clanged as Mrs. Hartwell bustled in, cheeks pink from the chill, and lips pursed tight enough to snap a thread. She leaned across the counter, the smell of lavender and boiled cabbage trailing after her. "Terrible business," she whispered, though the room was empty but for Miss Jenkins, who, at 72, had ears sharper than a fox and eyes that had missed nothing in 5 decades. "Lady Eleanor, found dead in her own sitting-room, police swarming about like hornets." "Dead?" Miss Jenkins gasped, nearly dropping her spoon into her teacup. "What from?" Mrs. Hartwell glanced around for effect, though there wasn't a soul to overhear, then leaned in closer. "Murder, they say." That word, murder, cracked through little Hemsby like a dropped plate. By noon it was on every tongue, slipping through hedges and over fences. The postman paused his route to speculate, the blacksmith downed tools to mutter darkly about money and morals, and at the heart of it all stood Hensley Manor, Lady Eleanor's sprawling estate, a stone colossus at the edge of town, its ivy-clad walls glaring down like an old governess disapproving of the world. It was there, just inside the grand entrance, that the details grew darker. A porcelain teacup lay shattered on the oriental rug, the spilled tea dark as blood against the intricate patterns. The fire had gone out in the hearth, leaving the room cold, despite the velvet curtains that hung heavy and suffocating. On the side table, a letter, half open, its edges stained with something darker than ink. And on the floor, a single lock of chestnut hair gleamed in the slanting light. The police poked and prodded, but the villagers, they had their own theories. "It's that Sir Reginald, I'd wager," someone whispered outside the bakery. "Always hanging about Lady Eleanor, wasn't he?" "Too friendly, if you ask me," another voice chimed in. "There's talk, you know, about the two of them. Talk." Little Hemsby thrived on it. Down by the village green, Sir Reginald himself stood under the skeletal branches of a beech tree, collar turned up against the cold. His face, lined but still handsome in a faded sort of way, was drawn tight with something between grief and anger. Across from him, Dr. Whittaker, friend, confidant, and occasional partner in gin-soaked chess matches, watched him with careful eyes. "You need to keep your head," Whittaker said quietly. "I didn't kill her," Reginald snapped, then sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair. "God help me, Whit, I didn't." "I believe you. Doesn't mean they will." Reginald's gaze drifted toward the manor, a shadow passing through his expression. "She was complicated. You know how people talk. We were close, yes, but this—" He shook his head. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Whittaker glanced at the gathering crowd, voices buzzing like wasps. "Truth is, Reg, doesn't matter what's supposed to happen, only what people believe did, and right now, they believe you." Across the street, Miss Marple watched from the window of the tea-shop, a quiet observer sipping a cup of weak Earl Grey. Her face, lined with the years but sharp with curiosity, betrayed nothing. Observing people was like knitting, she always said. Take enough stitches, pay close enough attention, and a pattern emerged. And this morning, she thought, stirring her tea, the pattern looked rather twisted indeed. The sun dipped lower as the village clung to its routines. Children herded home for supper. The baker's boy pulled down the shop shutters. But the air stayed thick with something unsaid. Somewhere in the folds of gossip and grief, truth waited. Hidden, quiet, watching, and Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and steady hands, was already threading the first stitch. The study at Hensley Manor smelled of old leather, dust, and secrets, the cloying mix that clung to the air like a stubborn guest who wouldn't leave. Heavy drapes filtered the wan afternoon light into syrupy gold that pooled across the Persian rug and the cluttered oak desk. On that desk lay the letter, its cream-coloured station incongruously fresh amid the room's decay of paper stacks and dog-eared books. Inspector Thompson, built like a man accustomed to tight collars and tighter truths, stood over the desk, fingers hovering about the letter as if it might bite. "Found in the top drawer," he said, to no one in particular, though his words floated toward Miss Marple, who sat primly in an armchair, knitting needles flashing like a metronome. "It's quite passionate," added Constable Davies. Awkward in his too small uniform, cheeks flushed, he handed Thompson a pair of gloves. Thompson slipped them on with the care of a man preparing for delicate surgery. He picked up the letter, unfolded it. The handwriting at first glance was elegant, each loop and curl deliberate, the ink dark as sin. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "every moment apart is a torment beyond measure. To see you, to hold you, these are my only desires. The world be damned if it stands between us." Thompson's lips compressed. "Reads like a penny novel." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "People often borrow from fiction when reality proves inconvenient," she murmured, eyes on her yarn, but ears keenly tuned. Sir Reginald, standing by the cold fireplace, shifted his weight. His face, lined and haggard, held the look of a man caught between indignation and disbelief. "It's a lie," he said, voice low but steady. "I never wrote that." "Funny," Thompson replied, not sounding amused. "Your name's at the bottom." Miss Marple's gaze drifted from her knitting to the letter. Her eyes, sharp and unassuming, traced the words. "May I?" Thompson hesitated. Then, with a nod, he passed it over. She held it delicately, as if the paper was something alive. The ink was fresh. Too fresh for a letter supposedly penned weeks prior, and the paper smooth, expensive, yet subtly different from the stationery she recalled seeing on Sir Reginald's writing desk. Small details, perhaps, but details mattered. "Curious," she murmured, almost to herself. Thompson raised a brow. "What's curious?" "The flourishes," she said, pointing with a knitting needle as if directing an orchestra. "See how the loops on the Y's and G's are exaggerated, almost theatrical. People rarely alter their handwriting unless they're trying to impress or deceive." Constable Davies frowned. "I thought fancy writing was just fancy writing." "Indeed," Miss Marple smiled faintly, "and sometimes a hat is just a hat, but not always." Reginald's shoulders sagged. "Someone's framing me." "Oh, you're very good at lying," Thompson shot back. Reginald's face darkened. "Believe what you will, Inspector. I had no reason to harm Eleanor." His gaze flicked to the letter, disgust twisting his features. "And I'd never write such drivel." Miss Marple's fingers smoothed the edge of the paper. There, a faint indentation beneath the ink, as if the writer had pressed too hard in places. Nervous or hurried, her mind catalogued it, tucking the detail away. Across the room, the manor clerk, Mr. Pemberton, a thin man with spectacles that seemed too large for his narrow face, cleared his throat. "If I may, Inspector," he produced a small leather-bound ledger. "I handle correspondence records. Sir Reginald's letters, those filed by Lady Eleanor, are written on Crane's ivory stock. This," he tapped the letter, "is Somerset linen weave. Different supplier entirely." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you mention that sooner? I assumed, well, Lady Eleanor was known to use varied stationery for personal letters." Pemberton's gaze darted toward Reginald, then away. Reginald exhaled sharply. "So now my taste in paper convicts me?" "No one's convicted yet," Thompson said, "but it's funny how a love letter turns up the day after Lady Eleanor dies, and your name's on it." Silence stretched long and taut. Outside, a branch scratched against the window-pane, rhythmic and faintly ominous. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, handing it back. "People lie, Inspector. Paper Thompson grunted. "We'll see. For now, Sir Reginald, don't leave town." Reginald gave a bitter laugh. "Where would I go? Hell's too crowded." Later that evening, Reginald sat alone in his own study, a smaller, less grand affair than Eleanor's, but no less sombre. A single lamp threw a pool of amber light across his desk, illuminating letters penned in his hand. His hand. He picked one up, an old note to Eleanor, written months ago. The loops were tighter, the lines less ornate. No flourishes, no theatre. His gaze drifted to a decanter. He poured whiskey, the liquid catching the light like tarnished gold, and drank. His eyes lingered on the letter from the Manor, now folded in his coat pocket. Words he didn't write, feelings he never voiced. Outside the wind rattled the shutters. Inside regret settled in the corners, thick and stubborn. Reginald rubbed his face, the weight of accusation settling heavy on his bones. Someone's framing me, he thought again. And somewhere someone smiled in the dark. The tea-room in Little Hemsby was the kind of place where secrets got steeped as strongly as the Earl Grey. Floral wallpaper, just a shade too busy, climbed the walls, and lace curtains softened the afternoon light into something that made even the chipped teacups look quaint rather than worn. The air smelled of warm scones, bergamot, and the kind of anticipation that comes when scandal is thick in the air. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner seat, half-shouldered by a potted fern that had seen better years. Her tea, lukewarm now, rested on a saucer chipped at the edge, and her knitting needles clacked with a steady rhythm. She wasn't knitting anything useful, just rows of stitches to keep her hands busy while her ears did the real work. The place hummed with chatter. Gossip flowed easier than the over-brewed tea. "I heard," said Mrs. Hartwell, leaning forward with the eagerness of someone who lived for these moments, "that Lady Eleanor's will leaves the manor to that nephew of hers, the foreign one." "Hardly foreign," Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "He's from Surrey, just took a fancy to travel." "That's as good as foreign to me." Miss Marple smiled faintly, counting stitches. 27, 28. People always thought talking to themselves wasn't talking at all. The bell above the door jingled and the tea-room shifted. Not everyone looked up, but everyone noticed. Lady Beatrice Hensley glided in, cool as frost. Her hat, a deep blue affair with an angle sharp enough to cut glass, tilted just so. She gave a nod to the room, eyes flicking over Miss Marple without acknowledgment, then slid into a corner booth. Her gloves, pale kid leather, peeled off with practised elegance. She ordered black coffee. Not tea, it was the kind of statement people made without words. Not 2 minutes later, Mr. Finlay arrived. Dark suit, clean but well worn, and shoes polished just enough to show he cared, but not enough to suggest vanity. His gaze scanned the room, quick, assessing. When it landed on Lady Beatrice, he hesitated, then crossed to a table near hers, not too close, not far, just enough to speak if needed, ignore if not. "Odd pair," murmured Mrs. Pritchard, loud enough for half the room to hear. Finlay's lips twitched, something like a smile, or maybe just a reaction to a sour memory. Miss Marple watched over the rim of her cup. Finlay's hands, he kept flexing them. Nervous habit or just cold fingers? His eyes lingered on the sugar bowl a second too long, as if debating whether to sweeten his tea or what to say next. Then there was Miss Penelope. She slipped in almost unnoticed, which was her way. Young, with a kind of fresh-faced prettiness that didn't seem to know it was pretty. She wore a modest dress, blue serge, and carried a satchel like a shield. She ordered chamomile and sat near the window, gaze distant. And yet, when Lady Beatrice mentioned the letter, low voice but not low enough, Penelope flinched. Barely, a blink too fast, a hand tightening on her cup's handle. "I told the inspector," Lady Beatrice said, voice smooth as satin and just as cool, "that Reginald always was reckless with his affections. Eleanor was a fool to indulge him." Finlay stirred his tea, slow circles. His glance met hers, brief, sharp. "And you were above such foolishness?" Lady Beatrice smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "I have always been practical." Miss Marple caught that. Practical, not kind, not honest, practical. People made for interesting suspects. "I still don't believe he'd kill her," Penelope said suddenly, surprising herself. Her cheeks flushed. Sir Reginald's not. Like that? Lady Beatrice's gaze pinned her like a butterfly under glass. How touching! Loyalty is so quaint. Finlay chuckled, humourless. Quaint's not the word I'd use. The tea-room settled into an uneasy silence. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. 4 o'clock. Long shadows stretched across the cobbled street, the kind that made everything look just a bit older, a bit sadder. Miss Marple gathered her knitting. 32 stitches dropped. No matter, the pattern was clear enough. She paused by Finlay's table on her way out. "Careful, Mr. Finlay," she said softly. "Sugar can sweeten things, but too much spoils the taste." He looked up, caught the twinkle in her eye. "You always talk in riddles, Miss Marple." "Not riddles, patterns. People are quite like knitting, you know. Pull one thread wrong and it all unravels." Outside, the wind had teeth, biting through wool and resolve. Miss Marple tugged her scarf tighter, boots tapping against the stones. Whispers followed her out the door, soft, insistent. Everyone had something to say, most of it wrong, but somewhere in all that chatter was the truth. You just had to listen between the lines. The evening wrapped itself around little Hemsby like an old moth-eaten coat, heavy with damp and more than a hint of something sour in the air. Street lamps flickered along the cobbled roads, casting pools of amber light that stretched long, wavering shadows across storefronts shuttered for the night. Somewhere a dog barked once and then thought better of it. Miss Marple didn't notice the cold. Not really. Her mind was a loom tonight, weaving patterns out of stray words and half-finished sentences. People talked when they thought no one listened. Even more when they thought someone was. Either way, you heard things, if you knew how to sit quietly enough. Her boots clicked a steady rhythm along the street as she turned the corner near the village green. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something floral. Lavender from Mrs. Hartswell's garden, likely. Miss Marple's nose wrinkled. Lovely plant, lavender, dreadful in a stew. Tonight's tea-room conversations replayed in her head. Lady Beatrice with her glacial poise and a tongue sharp enough to slice through soft cheese. Mr. Finlay, his eyes darting like a fox too long in the hen-house. And young Miss Penelope, whose loyalty to Lady Eleanor seemed genuine, though Marple had learnt long ago that genuine emotions were often the best disguises. People, so dreadfully predictable in their unpredictability. The manor rose up ahead, a hulking shape against the bruised sky. Most of its windows glowed softly, the warm lights inside belying the cold secrets held within. Miss Marple paused at the gate, fingers brushing the iron. The Hensley family had always carried themselves like royalty without the bother of a crown, and Lady Eleanor, well, she had been a woman who knew how to hold a room, and how to ruin one, too, if it suited her. The letter? That ridiculous, sentimental mess of words smeared in fresh ink and older lies. Sir Reginald's reaction earlier had been too quick to be rehearsed. Shock, yes. Anger, definitely. Guilt, hard to say. Guilt had a way of dressing itself up in all sorts of clothes. Miss Marple sighed and turned away from the manor. Answers weren't inside tonight. They were out here, among the whispers and glances that people thought went unnoticed. Back at her cottage, small, neat, with curtains drawn against the dark, she put the kettle on. It hissed like a cat with its tail stepped on, and the warmth seeped into her bones as she settled into the armchair by the fire. The flames cracked softly, throwing light against the floral wallpaper that had seen more years than she cared to admit. From the small side table she drew her notebook, a battered little thing with a leather cover soft from handling. Her pen hovered over the page. Lady Beatrice. Cold, practical. Too practised, money as a motive, but pride cuts deeper. Feigned indifference toward the letter. Too indifferent. Mr. Finlay, nervous, watches everyone, knows more than he lets on. Handwriting capable, possibly the forger. Why risk it for Eleanor? Pressure? Blackmail? Miss Penelope? Loyalty or guilt? Reaction to the letter's mention? Twitch of the hand? Fear? Or just nerves? Must speak with her privately. Miss Marple paused, tapping the pen against her chin. The tea cooled. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like an impatient visitor. She flipped back a page, eyes scanning her earlier notes. Motives circled in messy handwriting. Greed, jealousy, fear, love turned sour. Love, yes, people committed all sorts of foolish crimes for it. But this felt different. Love could be messy. This was calculated. Her pen scratched the paper again. Forgery requires two things, skill and intent. One's easier to find than the other. The fire crackled louder, a log shifting as if punctuating her thought. Closing the notebook, Miss Marple leaned back, eyes half-lidded. Patterns. That's all mysteries were, tangled yarn waiting to be teased apart. And if there was one thing she knew, it was how to find the thread that pulled the whole mess loose. Tomorrow would bring more questions. But tonight, the pieces had started to shift into place. Outside, the village slept. Inside, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. She wasn't knitting socks anymore. She was knitting the truth. Morning in Little Hemsby had a way of creeping in, soft at first, like a polite guest, then insistent as the church bell began its pealing. The village shook off its foggy blanket, dew clinging to hedgerows and cobblestones, slick with moisture. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, a cup of weak tea cooling on the table beside her notebook. Her sitting room was a tapestry of small comforts. Floral cushions worn from use, lace doilies that refused to stay flat, and the faint scent of lavender polish clinging to the furniture. Her pen tapped against the page. Names and notes sprawled across the paper in neat but relentless lines. Beatrice, Finley, fear, Penelope, loyalty or cover. Motives shifted like the fog outside her window. The forgery was at the heart of it. She felt that in her bones. But a forged letter didn't murder anyone, not without someone holding the pen and someone else pulling the strings. She sighed. Patterns, she murmured, always the patterns. With that she closed her notebook, slipped it into her handbag, and fastened her coat. Investigation, she always said, was best done on foot. People spoke differently outdoors, with fresh air and open skies. Secrets seemed less heavy out in the cold. The village cemetery lay on the edge of town, beyond a rusted gate that creaked like a door in an old ghost story. Moss crept along the headstones, names softened by wind and rain. Miss Marple's steps were measured, careful not to snag her skirt on the brambles that crept along the footpaths. It wasn't the dead she was interested in. The living always provided more intrigue. But sometimes gravestones spoke in ways people didn't. Near Lady Eleanor's family plot stood Mrs. Webb, a woman whose black shawl seemed to have been sewn directly onto her shoulders. Her face was a map of fine lines and judgmental creases. "Morning, Mrs. Webb," Miss Marple greeted, her tone as light as the morning air. "Terrible business, isn't it?" Mrs. Webb sighed, adjusting her grip on a small bouquet of wilting daisies. "To die like that, in one's own home," her eyes, sharp despite her years, flicked sideways. "Not that I'm one for gossip." "Of course not," Miss Marple said gently. "But they say Lady Eleanor had enemies. Family squabbles, you know. Money changes people." "Yes, I've always found money reveals character rather than changes it." Miss Marple glanced at the fresh flowers laid on Eleanor's grave. "Funny how grief brings out sudden fondness in those who hardly spoke to the person when they were alive." Mrs. Webb chuckled, dry as old parchment. "You always had a way with words, Miss Marple." "And Lady Beatrice?" Miss Marple let the question dangle. "Oh, she's as proud as they come. Always thought the manor should have been hers. Course Eleanor holding the purse strings didn't sit well." Miss Marple filed the comment away. Pride and resentment, fertile grounds for all manner of wrongdoing. Her next stop was Sir Reginald's residence, a modest brick house with ivy that clung like an old dog to a favourite blanket. Reginald answered the door looking as if sleep had been an optional indulgence. His tie was askew, his hair mussed. "If you've come to accuse me, Miss Marple—" "Nothing of the sort," she smiled. "I thought a cup of tea might soothe both our nerves." Reluctantly he let her in. The sitting-room was tidy enough, but bore signs of neglect. A half-empty glass of whisky on the sideboard, yesterday's newspaper folded but dog-eared. The headline glared, "Murder at Hensley Manor. Scandal unfolds." "She was a complicated woman," Reginald said, sinking into an armchair. "Eleanor, she knew how to twist people around her finger." His gaze drifted to the fireplace, where ashes sat cold. "And that blasted letter, 'Someone wants me ruined.' Do you know who?" Miss Marple asked softly. His mouth twitched. "Take your pick." "Beatrice resented her Finley. Well, he's got debts longer than that letter. And Penelope? Sweet girl, but blind where Eleanor was concerned." Miss Marple sipped her tea, lukewarm and bitter. "Resentment's one thing, murder's another." Reginald's laugh was hollow. "You think I don't know that? Half this village is pretending to mourn while wondering how quickly they can profit from it." "Profit," Miss Marple noted mentally. "Money again. Always money." On her walk back, the manor loomed, grey stone biting into the sky. She hadn't planned to stop, but instinct, never to be ignored, pulled her toward the servants' entrance. The kitchen door opened with a groan. Inside, the smell of baking bread mingled with polish, and something less pleasant. Fear. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, who met her, stern-faced, hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to tug her brows into perpetual disapproval. "Afternoon," Miss Marple began. "I won't take much of your time." Mrs. Greaves wiped her hands on her apron. "Not much to tell." "Oh, I imagine there's quite a bit. Houses like this, walls listen, doors remember." A pause, then a sigh. "It's that passage." "Isn't it?" Miss Marple's heart quickened, only slightly. "Passage?" "Old thing. Runs from the library to the study. Forgotten, mostly. But the other night I heard footsteps. Quiet, but not enough to fool these ears." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Anyone else know?" "Only family, and maybe that Finley fellow, always poking about with papers." "Finley." Again. Mrs. Greaves' lips pressed thin. "Lady Eleanor used it. Used to eavesdrop on guests. Said it kept people honest. Or gave her an advantage," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Greaves just nodded. Outside dusk crept in, painting the village in bruised purples and sooty greys. Miss Marple stood for a moment beneath the bare branches of a tree, pulling her notebook free. Her pen moved quickly. Secret passage. Access to study. Letter planted. Opportunity. Who benefits from Reginald's ruin? Beatrice? Inheritance motive? Finley? Debt? Penelope? Loyalty or blackmail? Passage suggests premeditation, someone who knew the house well. The wind stirred her skirt, whispering against the pages. Miss Marple closed the notebook with a decisive snap. Patterns, always patterns. And now she was beginning to see the weave. Tomorrow the truth would start to unravel, and with it someone's carefully stitched lie. Evening crept over Little Hemsby like a slow fog, softening the village's sharp edges until everything looked dipped in ash and old stories. Lamps flickered to life one by one, casting puddles of amber light along cobbled lanes polished slick by mist. Shops had shuttered. Voices grew fewer, footsteps quieter. It was the kind of hush that seemed to seep into bones, making secrets feel heavier. Miss Marple didn't mind the dark. Night had a way of loosening tongues and tightening alibis. More importantly, it dulled the sheen of appearances. People wore their true faces after dusk, thinking the shadows granted them privacy. Foolish notion. Her boots crunched along the gravel path that wound toward the village green. The cold pinched at her cheeks, pinking the skin, but her steps remained steady. There was comfort in movement, in the familiar rhythm of thought and stride, and tonight thoughts swirled like leaves caught in a November gust. The letter, too perfect to be careless, too dramatic to be genuine. Someone had known what they were doing, enough to imitate Sir Reginald's hand without overplaying it. But it wasn't just the handwriting, it was timing, placement, intent. And then there was the passage in the manor, a relic from another age, tucked away behind shelves of leather-bound pretense and generations of whispered deceit. Who knew of it? Family, mostly. Finlay, perhaps. Someone who understood that walls in old houses listen. Her lips pursed as she recalled Lady Beatrice's words earlier that day. Eleanor always enjoyed games. I, for one, prefer clarity. The kind of statement that meant absolutely nothing while sounding terribly important. Beatrice was clever. Not as clever as she thought, perhaps, but clever enough to keep a blade tucked behind her silk smile. And Finlay, twitchy, defensive Finlay. Too quick with denials, too slow with eye contact. Debts were a strong motive. Money made people do things shame wouldn't. Yet guilt wore different clothes than fear. Finlay's looked like a poorly cut suit of both. Then there was Penelope, sweet, soft-voiced Penelope, whose loyalty to Lady Eleanor seemed as steadfast as it was curious. People didn't idolize the cruel unless they had reason, or they'd seen something that twisted admiration into complicity. Questions spiraled, motives tangled, but patterns were emerging, faint outlines forming beneath layers of performance and half-truths. The village green spread out before her, an open space rimmed by blackened trees whose bare branches clawed at the silver-thread sky. Beyond the green stood the weathered village sign, wooden, battered by years of rain and wind, its letters faded but proud. Welcome to Little Hemsby. Est 1784? Ivy curled along the edges, stubborn and invasive, like old gossip refusing to die. Miss Marple paused before it. Her breath fogged the air, dissipating quickly. Fingers gloved in wool traced the carved letters absently. This place, so picturesque, so perfectly contained, held more venom beneath its thatched roofs than any sprawling city she'd known. Big towns wore their corruption openly. Little villages dressed theirs up in lace curtains and polite smiles. Her gaze drifted back toward the manor, a distant silhouette against the dark horizon. One murder, one letter, one lie that had set the whole place buzzing like disturbed hornets. She should leave it to the police, let Inspector Thompson plod through facts and trip over red herrings. It wasn't her concern, not really. And yet, the thing about patterns was that once you saw the first thread pull free, you couldn't ignore it, not without wondering what would unravel next. The wind stirred her skirt, lifting it just enough to tug at her resolve. Not that she needed convincing. Curiosity had always been her vice, though she preferred to call it diligence. Drawing her notebook from her bag, she flipped to the last page. The paper caught the light just enough to illuminate her neat handwriting. Motives. Beatrice. Inheritance. Pride. Old grievances polished sharp. Finlay. Money. Desperation wrapped in excuses. Penelope. Loyalty or guilt. People love to protect ghosts of better times. Reginald. Scapegoat or fool, possibly both. Next steps. Verify financial records. Greed leaves footprints. Revisit Manor's guest logs. Patterns in presence. Speak to Penelope alone, away from eyes and ears. Passage, access key. Who carried it? Who benefits? Her pen hovered. One last note. A truth whispered beneath everything. Everyone lies. Not everyone hides it well. The notebook snapped shut. Miss Marple glanced up at the village sign one last time. Behind her, somewhere in the fog, a dog barked twice. Sharp, echoing. She didn't flinch. Didn't look back. Turning on her heel, she walked into the mist-thickened night. The kind of night where things could slip between the cracks, where truths waited in corners to be dragged into the light. She'd find them, even if it meant stirring up more than she intended. Some patterns weren't meant to be unravelled. But that never stopped her before. Lady Eleanor's manor stood under a low slate-grey sky, its stone facade brooding like a matron disapproving of its guests. The ivy clawing at the walls seemed less decorative, more like something trying to strangle the place. The wind bit cold, slipping through coats and manners alike. Miss Marple tightened her scarf. "Odd, isn't it?" she said, voice light but eyes sharp. "How houses can hold grudges longer than people." Inspector Thompson grunted, boots crunching on the gravel drive. "Houses don't kill people, Miss Marple." "No," she murmured, "but they do hide things rather well." Inside, the manor breathed old money and older secrets. The scent of furniture polish and faded roses hung in the air, mingling with the faint must of damp stone. Heavy velvet drapes sagged at the windows, muffling the afternoon light into something sullen and half-hearted. Mrs. Greaves, the housekeeper, met them in the foyer, apron spotless, lips pursed into a line tight enough to cut paper. "You'll find what you need in the east wing," she said, voice clipped. "Not much use to anyone these days. Lady Eleanor preferred her west parlour, said the east wing was full of draughts and ghosts." "Ghosts rarely pen letters," Miss Marple said. The housekeeper didn't smile. "Wouldn't be so sure." They followed the creaking floorboards to a seldom-used corridor lined with portraits that stared out with that peculiar mix of aristocratic boredom and judgment. Oil paint cracked with age, faces frozen in expressions that seemed to say, "We know things you never will." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on one, a woman with a thin mouth and eyes like chipped glass. "Family resemblance is strong," she noted. "Blood runs deep in houses like this," Thompson muttered, reaching for a candelabra left abandoned on a side table. He lit it, casting flickering light across peeling wallpaper and dust motes swirling like tiny ghosts of their own. Near the end of the hallway, a portrait hung crooked. Sir Percival Hensley, according to the tarnished plaque. Thompson frowned. "Funny spot for him, isn't it? Doesn't match the rest." Miss Marple stepped closer, gloved fingers tracing the frame. Her touch found what her eyes had already guessed. A faint notch along the edge. She pressed it, and with a groan like an old man standing from a chair, the portrait swung open to reveal a narrow doorway cut into the wall. "Well," she said, "isn't that theatrical?" Thompson exhaled through his nose, half a laugh. "Secret passage, like something out of a dime novel, or a well-planned alibi," she said. The passage yawned, dark and cool, smelling of damp stone and forgotten things. Dust caked the floor, thick enough to hold footprints, though not fresh ones. Cobwebs stretched like gossamer drapes across the entrance, disturbed now by Thompson's gloved hand as he pushed them aside. The walls closed in as they entered, rough stone grazing their shoulders. The candelabra threw long, jittery shadows that danced along the narrow confines. Floorboards beneath their feet creaked in protest. "Built for servants, likely," Thompson said, voice hushed by the tight walls. "Back when houses like this ran on whispers and silver trays." "They still do," Miss Marple said. "The silver just changes hands." A dozen paces in, something snagged Thompson's boot. He paused, crouched. "A fabric," he murmured, holding up a torn piece of dark cloth, edges frayed. "Recent tear." Miss Marple peered closer. "Wool blend, men's suiting, I'd wager, quality fabric, though worn." Her gaze slid toward the inspector. "Remind you of anyone's wardrobe?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "Finlay wears a suit like that?" "Yes." Her tone was mild. "But so does half the village on Sundays." Farther in, the passage sloped downward. The air thickened, dampness clinging to skin and breath. Another few feet, and they came upon a small alcove, a space just large enough for someone to stand and listen. The walls bore faint scratches, deliberate marks, not decoration, directions. Thompson ran his fingers over them. "Like someone's been using this." Miss Marple's gaze caught something lower on the wall, a dark smudge, ink, fresh enough to smear under her glove. "The letter," she murmured, "same ink." "Finlay again?" Thompson's voice was tight with suspicion. "Possibly." She tilted her head. "But ink can be borrowed." "Motives less so." They pressed on. The passage ended behind a panel that, when nudged, opened into the study, Lady Eleanor's sanctuary, and more recently her tomb. The air here was different, still carrying the faint notes of perfume and aged brandy. The room hadn't been touched since the police sealed it. The teacup remained shattered on the floor like a memory someone refused to clean up. Miss Marple's eyes roved the room. "So easy to frame someone when you control the setting," she said softly. Thompson frowned. "Meaning?" "Whoever planted that letter knew how to get in and out unseen, used the passage, left just enough evidence to point at Reginald and perhaps at Finlay." Her gaze sharpened. "Too neat, wouldn't you say?" He nodded slowly. "Red herring, or a well-laid trap." The candelabra flickered, throwing shifting patterns across the book-lined walls. Outside, the wind rattled a window pane, a skeletal branch tapping in a rhythm that felt too deliberate. Thompson straightened, slipping the torn fabric into an evidence pouch. "We're getting close," he said. Miss Marple's smile was thin. "Close is when people get careless or desperate." They stood a moment longer, the room holding its breath around them. Then Thompson blew out the candles, plunging them into darkness. "Tomorrow we start shaking the trees," he said. "See which apples fall." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the shattered teacup, the ink stain on the desk, the hidden door behind them. So many pieces, but the pattern was emerging. Threads pulled, knots tightening. As they stepped back into the corridor, the passage closing behind them with a reluctant creak, the manor seemed to settle, the walls swallowing their footsteps. But the house wasn't quiet. Houses like this never were. The little Hemsby police station smelled faintly of damp wood, stale tobacco, and the lingering ghost of too many strong teas. A brass clock on the wall ticked with officious purpose, marking every second that stretched between doubt and discovery. In the back room, a space more accustomed to dealing with lost umbrellas and minor disputes over hedgerow boundaries, an oak table groaned beneath the weight of papers, blueprints, and possibility. Inspector Thompson rolled up his sleeves. His tie, loosened hours ago, dangled like a noose forgotten in the day's exhaustion. Across from him, Miss Marple sat poised, her coat draped over the back of her chair, gloves neatly folded on the table. Her notebook lay open, pages crisscrossed, with tidy script and annotations sharp enough to cut through lies. "Let's make sense of it," Thompson said, rubbing his temples. "Before this whole village convinces itself ghosts did it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ghosts, Inspector? I thought you didn't believe in fairy tales." "Don't," he grunted, "but I do believe people will tell themselves anything to sleep at night." On the table, the forged love letter, its ink still dark and theatrical in its sentiment. A scrap of wool fabric, torn at the edges, found in the manor's hidden passage. Architectural blueprints of Hensley Manor, their parchment edges curling with age, revealing the clandestine passageways that twisted through the estate like veins through a body. Handwritten notes, names, motives, alibis, scribbled fragments hoping to form a coherent truth. Thompson tapped the letter. "Finlay's handwriting is close, but Pemberton from the library swears the strokes are off. Says whoever wrote this letter tried too hard to copy Reginald's style." Miss Marple nodded. "A forgery meant to be found isn't just about handwriting. It's about timing, placement, theatricality." Her gaze drifted to the blueprints. "Which brings us to the passage. Why stage the letter there? Why not leave it somewhere less contrived?" "To frame Reginald," Thompson said. "Obvious, isn't it?" "Yes, but obvious doesn't always mean correct." She leaned forward, fingertip tracing the hidden corridor on the blueprint. "The fabric scrap, good quality wool, not uncommon, but the colour and weave are distinctive." Thompson flipped through photographs until he found one of Lady Beatrice at the manor's garden party, a dark wool coat draped over her shoulders. "Matches hers," he said grimly. "Convenient," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps too convenient." Thompson sighed. "You think she's being framed?" "She's proud, not careless. Prideful people don't leave breadcrumbs unless they want someone to follow." Silence stretched between them, thick with thought. Outside the village settled into its nighttime hush, lanterns dimming and doors bolting against the cold and the truth. Thompson's knuckles rapped the table. Finlay had motive, money troubles. Beatrice had motive, inheritance. Penelope, well, she had loyalty to Eleanor, but that doesn't translate to murder. Sometimes loyalty turns sour, Miss Marple said. But let's consider opportunity. Finlay knew the house, knew the passage existed. Beatrice knew too, but she's always preferred more direct methods. And Reginald? Thompson asked. Reginald's too transparent. His guilt's a mask for shame, not murder. Her lips pursed. Though he's a convenient scapegoat. A pause. Then Thompson gestured at the table. Everything points to Beatrice or Finlay. Perhaps both. Miss Marple's voice was soft but carried weight. Or perhaps we've been looking at it from the wrong angle. Thompson frowned. How do you mean? The forgery was meant to direct attention to Reginald, yes, but also to whoever found it. People overlook the finder in favour of the accused. She glanced at her notes. And people rarely question the loyal. They question the ambitious and the indebted. Thompson's brow furrowed. Penelope. She had access, she had proximity, and she had reason. Lady Eleanor's protection was both a gift and a prison. Freedom can be a powerful motive. He leaned back, exhaling. So what? You're saying the sweet, quiet companion forged a letter, used the passage, and staged this whole thing. I'm saying people aren't always what they seem, Miss Marple replied. Penelope loved Eleanor, yes, but love twisted by control and resentment becomes something else entirely. Thompson rubbed his face. Christ, I thought this was a simple case. It never is. Her gaze returned to the table, to the puzzle that was no longer missing pieces. Just waiting for them to be arranged correctly, tick-tock went the brass clock. Time pressing forward, truth waiting. Thompson leaned in, voice low. We confront them tomorrow. Tomorrow, Miss Marple agreed. Her hand closed her notebook with a decisive snap. The picture is nearly complete. Her eyes met his across the cluttered table. A shared understanding passing between them. They were close, the kind of close that made people dangerous, the kind that drew out desperation and mistakes. One last piece, she said softly, hidden in plain sight. Outside, the village sign swayed in the wind, creaking like bones settling. Inside, 2 investigators stared at fragments of lies and waited for morning. When dawn came, there'd be no more hiding. Not for anyone. The courtroom was a grand old thing, oak-panelled walls that reeked of varnish and old secrets, brass fixtures dulled by decades of hushed judgments, and rows of benches worn smooth by the anxious and the accused. High above, stained glass windows filtered the morning light into muted shards of colour that splashed onto the gallery like a forgotten painter's palette. The air was thick, part dust, part expectation, part something less tangible but far heavier. Miss Marple sat quietly in the 3rd row, a position chosen for its balance between observation and anonymity. Her hat, modest but respectable, cast a soft shadow over her keen eyes as she surveyed the room. People didn't come to court for justice, they came for spectacle. The crowd murmured like a restless tide. Village folk squeezed beside city journalists, all of them hungry for a scandal to sip with their afternoon tea. At the front, Sir Reginald sat in the dock, looking every bit the tragic figure. His suit, though well-tailored, sagged under the weight of weeks spent in tension and scrutiny. His face, once a portrait of charm, had hollowed. His eyes rimmed with the kind of weariness that no amount of brandy could cure. He stared ahead, jaw tight, fingers interlocked as if holding himself together. The judge, a broad-shouldered man whose wig looked like it had been borrowed from a scarecrow, cleared his throat, a gravelly sound that rolled through the room like distant thunder. "Prosecution," he drawled, "you may proceed." A young barrister in a crisp black robe rose, spectacles gleaming under the chandeliers. His voice was smooth, the kind of smooth that came from both practice and privilege. "Your Honour, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we are here today to consider the damning evidence against Sir Reginald Pembroke, evidence that suggests not just motive, but action. The linchpin of this case," he held up a document sealed in plastic, "is this letter, a declaration of love turned to obsession, words that, tragically, led to Lady Eleanor Hensley's untimely death." He let the words hang. The room leaned in. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked quietly in her lap. Too theatrical, she thought. A good prosecutor knew drama was half the battle, but too much flash risked burning the truth. The letter was passed to the jury, heads bending over it like scholars studying a relic. Some frowned. One woman gasped, though whether at the words or the implications, who could say? "Sir Reginald," the prosecutor turned, "do you deny writing this letter?" Reginald's voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "I do. And yet," the prosecutor's tone shifted to condescension, "the handwriting is remarkably similar to yours. The language, intimate. The passion, undeniable." "I didn't write it," Reginald repeated, "and I never loved her." A ripple ran through the gallery, half scandalized, half enthralled. Love turned sour, made for better gossip than murder ever could. "Your Honour," the defence attorney, a stout man with the patient face of someone accustomed to uphill battles, rose. "We dispute the authenticity of that letter. Handwriting analysis is inconclusive, and there is no direct evidence linking my client to the scene of the crime." The judge grunted. "Noted. Continue." Witnesses paraded through the stand like actors hitting their marks. Lady Beatrice, cold and poised, testified with clipped precision. Reginald was reckless. Eleanor indulged him, foolishly so. Her gaze flicked toward the defendant with something between disdain and satisfaction. Was it truth or performance? Mr. Finlay followed, nervous, damp with sweat, eyes darting. I just found the letter," he stammered. "In her desk, I thought. It seemed important." Miss Marple watched his hands, the way they clenched, released, clenched again. People lied with their mouths. Their fingers told the real story. Penelope took the stand last, her face pale but composed. "Lady Eleanor was kind to me," she said softly. "Sir Reginald took advantage of that kindness." Her words were careful, each syllable placed like a stepping stone across treacherous waters. Miss Marple's brow creased. Not what she's saying, she thought, what she's avoiding. Then came the cross-examinations, legal sparring dressed in civility but sharp enough to bleed. The defence hammered at the letter's inconsistencies. The prosecution leaned into Reginald's supposed jealousy. Accusations flew like darts, some hitting their mark, others glancing off. Time stretched, the clock ticked, breath was held, released, and then quiet. The judge rubbed his temple. "Closing remarks tomorrow," he intoned. "Court adjourned." The gavel's crack echoed through the chamber, final as a coffin lid. People filed out, voices swelling like a tide returning. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions no one answered. Miss Marple lingered, eyes on the empty stand. The pieces were there, scattered, yes, but forming a shape. Almost, not quite. One piece left, hidden in plain sight. She gathered her things, glancing at Reginald being led away. Their eyes met, just for a moment, enough to see the frayed edges of a man unravelling. Tomorrow the truth would stand up. Whether anyone liked it or not, courtrooms have their own kind of air. Dense, stagnant, thick with tension and whispered judgment. The one in Little Hemsby was no exception. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of villagers packed shoulder to shoulder, drawn like moths to the glow of scandal. Lawyers shuffled papers. A woman in the gallery dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether for the victim or the drama no one could say. Miss Marple sat toward the back, knitting, resting untouched on her lap. Her gaze swept the room, noting every shift, every glance. People spoke with their bodies long before their mouths caught up. At the front, Mr. Finlay took the stand. He tugged at his collar, sweat beading at his hairline despite the courtroom's chill. His eyes darted not to the judge, not to the jury, but to Lady Beatrice, seated primly at the prosecution table. Not a glance exchanged, but there was a story in that silence. The young prosecutor rose, voice smooth as varnish. "Mr. Finlay, you claim to have discovered the letter. Would you describe the circumstances?" Finlay swallowed. I was organizing Lady Eleanor's papers. She asked me to look into some financial ledgers. I opened a drawer in her writing desk and it was just there." "Just there," the prosecutor repeated, letting the words settle like dust. "And your immediate thought was to bring it to the authorities?" "Yes. Well, it seemed important." Finlay's fingers twisted in his lap, knuckles whitening. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Nerves. Guilt? Or something else?" The defense attorney stood, his build solid, voice less polished but carrying weight. "Mr. Finlay, how long had you been in Lady Eleanor's employ?" 6 months, Finlay said, voice thin. "And during that time did you have access to her personal correspondence?" "Yes, but—" "Answer the question, please." "Yes. So, it wouldn't be difficult for you to insert a letter where it didn't belong?" Objections rose, the judge waved them down, but the suggestion hung in the air like smoke after a shot fired. Finlay's face crumpled. I didn't forge anything," but no one seemed convinced, not fully. Next to take the stand was Lady Beatrice, resplendent in black crepe and frost. Her posture was a lesson in aristocratic disdain, every movement measured, every word sharpened to a point. The prosecutor asked his questions. She answered with the cool efficiency of someone accustomed to having the last word. "You were close to Lady Eleanor?" he prodded. A faint smile. "As close as two sisters can be, which is to say, not very." "And how did you feel about Sir Reginald's relationship with your sister?" Her eyes flicked toward the defendant, brief, dismissive. "My feelings are irrelevant. Eleanor had her preferences." The defense lawyer's turn was less courteous. "Lady Beatrice, did you stand to gain financially from your sister's death?" "Certainly not," she said. "My inheritance was fixed years ago." "Yet you knew about the passageways in the manor." "I grew up in that house," she replied coolly. "Of course I knew. But you never used them." Her gaze hardened. "Childish nonsense." Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation. Not a lie, precisely, but not the truth either. People like Beatrice built walls from half-truths, hard to climb, easy to hide behind. Sir Reginald's turn at the stand was a study in unravelling composure. His voice, though firm at first, wavered under cross-examination. "You expect us to believe," the prosecutor sneered, "that despite your documented relationship with Lady Eleanor, you never wrote her a letter of this nature?" "I never wrote that letter," Reginald snapped. "And I certainly didn't." "You were seen arguing with her the night before her death." "A disagreement," Reginald shot back. "Nothing more." Miss Marple watched the jury, eyes narrowing, lips pursed. Arguments between lovers were easy to believe. Too easy. During the recess, the courtroom emptied into murmurs and cigarette smoke. Miss Marple stepped out into a side corridor where a young barrister waited, nervous, his hair too neat for someone so obviously frazzled. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a quick nod, "I found something." He handed her a folded document. His voice dropped. "It's from the solicitor's office. A codicil to Lady Eleanor's will." She unfolded it. Her lips tightened. "Ah," she murmured. "It changes everything," he whispered. "Leaves a majority to Penelope if Eleanor remained unmarried." "And she was about to change that," Miss Marple finished. "Sir Reginald?" He nodded. "Rumour or not, if they married, Penelope lost everything." Greed. Not always about having more. Sometimes it was about not having less. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the courtroom doors. Almost complete, she thought. Just one thread left. Court resumed, the room swelling with anticipation. Whispers scuttled through the gallery like mice in the walls. The judge cleared his throat. "Any further witnesses?" Miss Marple stood. Heads turned. The gallery rustled. The prosecutor frowned. The defense lawyer blinked. "Miss Marple," the judge said, surprise flickering across his features, "do you have something to add?" Her voice was calm but carried like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Your Honour, I believe I can clarify the events surrounding Lady Eleanor's death." Murmurs. Chairs scraped. Eyes darted. She stepped forward, knitting set aside, hands steady. "The truth," she said, "has been hiding in plain sight." The courtroom held its breath, and somewhere outside the village clock struck noon. Courtrooms have a peculiar kind of stillness, the kind that settles in just before a storm breaks, breathless, weighted. In little Hensby's modest courtroom that stillness was palpable. Every cough was muffled, every whisper died on tongues, as Miss Marple stood, unassuming in her tweed coat and sensible shoes. There was no grand flourish, no dramatic clearing of the throat, just a small woman with sharp eyes and sharper wits, standing in front of a room filled with people who thought they already knew the truth. The judge, his robes heavy with authority and dust, gave her a nod. "Proceed, Miss Marple." She adjusted her gloves, gaze sweeping the room. Sir Reginald, pale and frayed at the edges, sat rigidly in the dock. Mr. Finlay, hands clenched tight, refused to meet her eyes. Penelope's face was a study in dread, while Lady Beatrice, impeccable composed, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Marple began, her voice calm but carrying the weight of finality. "It is often said that the simplest explanation is the correct one. But simplicity is a trickster. It leads us to see what's obvious instead of what's true." A rustle of fabric, a creak of a wooden bench. No one dared interrupt. "From the beginning this case was draped in misdirection," she continued. "A forged love letter pointed the finger at Sir Reginald, passion, jealousy. It's a tidy motive, one people are quick to believe." Her gaze flicked to the jury. "We like our scandals simple." The prosecutor opened his mouth, thought better of it, and sat back. "But," Miss Marple said, "details, those pesky, stubborn details, tell a different story." She held up the fabric scrap, its edges frayed. "Found in the hidden passage, a passage known to few, used to stage the scene, not to commit the murder. Lady Eleanor died of poison in her tea, not violence, but to ensure the letter was found precisely where it needed to be." "Circumstantial?" Lady Beatrice's attorney interjected. "Is it?" Miss Marple's smile was thin. "Lady Beatrice owns a coat made from that very fabric. She claims no involvement, but consider this. Lady Beatrice knew about the passage. She had motive, financial and personal. Resentment festers over years, but greed has a timetable." Her gaze shifted. "With Lady Eleanor alive, the manor and its wealth remained beyond reach. But a conveniently discovered letter suggesting an affair with Sir Reginald," she paused, "enough to scandalize, disinherit, and shift public sentiment." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lady Beatrice's lips pressed into a line, composure cracking. "And Mr. Finlay?" Miss Marple turned toward him. "He forged the letter. Not out of loyalty, but debt. Gambling debts, as Inspector Thompson discovered. A man squeezed from both ends makes desperate choices." She let that sink in. Finlay planted the letter under Beatrice's instruction. He used the passage to avoid detection. Simple, efficient, wickedly effective. Finlay's head dropped into his hands. The room's tension snapped taut as violin strings. "And how," Miss Marple added softly, "was Lady Eleanor murdered?" "Arsenic, found in her teacup, not uncommon, kept in the manor's gardening shed, but the tea was prepared by someone she trusted." Her gaze fell on Penelope. "Someone with motive disguised as loyalty. Miss Penelope, fearing loss of security if Lady Eleanor married, was complicit, not in planning, but in execution. She poisoned the tea under Beatrice's persuasion." Penelope burst into tears. I didn't mean she promised it wouldn't kill her, just make her ill enough to stop the marriage." But Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Intent is a fine line, my dear, and death rarely cares for intentions." The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" Lady Beatrice stood, voice cold and clipped. "So you believe I orchestrated this farce for money? For power?" Miss Marple corrected gently. Money's just the means, control was the end. Silence swallowed the room. Finley's shoulders sagged in defeat. Penelope sobbed quietly. Eyes dark, mouth tight with fury. Sir Reginald closed his eyes, relief washing over his features. The judge cleared his throat, heavy with gravity. Charges will be amended in light of this evidence. Court adjourned pending further investigation. Outside, the crowd buzzed like hornets stirred from a nest. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Scandal would fill papers by morning. Miss Marple stepped onto the cobbled street, exhaling into the cool air. Inspector Thompson caught up, shaking his head. "Never fails. The quiet ones are always the ones to watch," she smiled faintly. "People show you who they are if you watch long enough." "And Beatrice?" he asked. "Could have fooled me. They usually do," she said, "until they don't." As the bells tolled noon, the village sign creaked in the wind. Little Hempsby would settle back into its routines soon enough, scandal fading into memory, replaced by gossip about gardens and weather. But houses held their stories, and some doors, once opened, never quite closed. Miss Marple turned for home. There'd be tea waiting, and perhaps, just perhaps, no more letters for a while. There's a moment in every courtroom, after the revelations, after the accusations fall like dominoes, where the air shifts. Relief and ruin breathe the same air. For some it's salvation, for others the beginning of the end. Miss Marple's final words hung in the silence like lingering smoke. Eyes darted from Lady Beatrice, stone-faced and defiant, to Mr. Finley, his head bowed under the weight of exposed guilt. Penelope's quiet sobs punctuated the hush, guilt and regret unravelling in her lap like a frayed ribbon. Then the murmurs began, low, buzzing, like a swarm of hornets roused from a nest. Flashbacks flickered across the room's collective memory. Finley's shaky testimony, once read as nerves, now reinterpreted as the squirming of a man caught in a trap he set himself. Lady Beatrice's calculated calm, no longer regal but reptilian, poise masking poison. Penelope's soft loyalty twisted into fear-fueled complicity drawn tight under Eleanor's shadow. Miss Marple stood steady, her gaze cool. People weren't puzzles to her, not really. They were patterns. And patterns, no matter how complex, always revealed their seams. The judge's gavel fell hard. "Court adjourned," he said, his voice gravelly but firm. "Arrests will be carried out immediately. Bail is denied." Finley crumpled as uniformed officers descended. Beatrice remained upright, lips pressed tight enough to cut. "It was for the family," she hissed, voice low but laced with venom. "For what she stole from us." Miss Marple's reply was soft. "And what did you steal in return?" Sir Reginald, freed but not unscarred, looked across at her. Gratitude flickered there, tempered by something else. Shame, perhaps. Not for what he'd done, but for how close ruin had brushed him. Guilt, after all, wasn't exclusive to the guilty. Outside, the village streets stretched under a wan afternoon sky, clouds smudged grey and tired. Reporters scattered like crows, pens scratching as townsfolk spilled out with wide eyes and ready tongues. Miss Marple stepped past them all, the din fading with each careful her heels clicked against cobblestones, echoing softly between buildings that would soon buzz with fresh gossip. The wind tugged at her coat, bringing with it the faint scent of rain and distant lavender. Greed, envy, fear, threads woven tight into human nature's tapestry. Eleanor's death had pulled them taut, unravelling far more than a single crime. Old resentments, quiet betrayal. It was never just the murder, it was the echoes that rippled out, touching lives in places they hadn't realized were vulnerable. Ahead, the village sign swayed gently. "Welcome to Little Hempsby Est. 1784. The letters faded but stubborn, like the place itself, like the people. Her mind lingered on Penelope. Desperation clouds reason. How far would any of them have gone to protect their place in the world? And Beatrice, so certain righteousness justified the means. Justice was served. But justice, she knew, didn't always feel like victory, not when ruin was so personal. Reaching her gate, Miss Marple paused, glancing back toward the manor, its roofline jagged against the horizon. Secrets sealed back within its walls. For now. Inside, the kettle whistled, the fire crackled its familiar song. Warmth in a world that often ran cold. As she settled into her chair, notebook closed, knitting needles at hand, her gaze softened. People were curious things, capable of cruelty, yes, but also kindness. Sometimes both lived in the same heartbeat. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, darkening the earth and washing the streets clean, for now. Because in places like Little Hemsby, truth never stayed buried for long. But for tonight there was tea and peace. And perhaps, in the stillness between the stitches of her knitting, a moment to breathe.